Good morning, students. Hopefully you're having a great day wherever you're at and whatever you're doing. Before we get started here, I want to brag a little bit about my tie. There's actually two reasons why I wear this tie. One is to honor George Washington. This is Washington crossing the Delaware. I'm a big fan of George Washington. I like him quite a bit. And also to show you that I do know how to tie a tie. This would be the lecture I would have given on April the 7th. That's Tuesday morning class. And as you can see over here, we are in the midst of discussing World War I. Also, in fact, last thing I think we discussed were the battles of Verdun and the Somme. Also, since this is for April the 7th, we have an assignment that was due today. In fact, I hope you all had no problem in handing that in electronically. And that is your review of the book, A German Deserter's War Experience. So I think it'd be appropriate to discuss that book a little bit with you now. You're all experts. You've all read it. I think this is really quite nice. See if I can get let's get a representation. We don't know who that man is, but quite frankly, he's a German soldier. From his outfit, this was what Germans were wearing in 1914 and 1915. By the time you get to 1916, they were wearing the Stahlhelm, or the steel helmet. This is actually helmets made out of leather. So this is very appropriate, though this is not a photograph of the German deserter. The man has actually never been identified. I can speculate as to why that might be. One of which is maybe he went back to Germany after the war. Maybe he died. Maybe he just didn't want to be recognized. In any event, let's take a look at the book. You might ask the question, why did I ask you to read this book? Well, I'm big into the First World War. In fact, I've taught the World War I class on numerous occasions. I might even be teaching again over at BYU in the fall. I don't even remember when I found this. I don't remember how I found this. There are times when I get interested, I want to read another first-person account. I'll go online. I'll go to the shelves of a BYU library, have an excellent collection, and just pull something off and start reading it. Well, I found this online. I don't remember when, and I read it. I've read a lot of these. I can't give you a number. Dozens anyway of first-person accounts of men who had been in the First World War. This is among the handful of the very, very best. There's some other very important books that I could recommend. Let's not burden you with that right now. Usually in a class like this, when I'm asking you to read something, I'll turn to the students and say, okay, once again, what is the content of the book? And one of the things I very often get, both in reviews and in comments in class, is this man was a socialist. Yes, he was. Okay, he's unabashedly socialist. That is part of his perspective. Socialists do have a tendency to be quite more interested in the affairs of the lower classes. And some people actually mention like he was a disease or something. Like this guy's irrational because he's a socialist. I don't think we can dismiss somebody because we may or may not agree with his political leanings. You see, in my case, I'm sure you realize by now, I'm a capitalist swine. As a capitalist swine, would you necessarily listen to me because I'm coming here with a bias? Quite frankly, everybody has a bias. It's very helpful if you can recognize them. So I'm not going to dismiss him because of his socialist leanings. His account is harrowing. It's really quite explicit. And as I've already mentioned, it is among the very best which I've read. I read a book by an author who claimed to have read 100 first-person accounts. And he listed another account as being the best. The account he mentioned by Lucy is very, very good, but it's not better than this one. So in my opinion, this is very, very strong. He doesn't want to go to war. How many men want to go to war? Really? I know we do have the sense of adventure. We're young. I remember that. I used to be young. You're young, you're adventuresome, you want to get out, you want to prove your mettle. I'm a man, I want to go out and conquer things. If you didn't do that, we would spend our lifetimes in the basements of our parents doing very little. Everybody wants to do that to a certain extent. A lot of young men want to have their manhood tested. That's also very common. Sometimes they get their manhood tested on a football field and sporting activities. But I do want to caution you, if you're still in that stage of your life, it's normal development, that you're going to find challenges. You're going to find plenty of challenges. In any event, but he's not one of these men who actually look forward to this. Quite frankly, he's negative on the entire experience. He is somewhat distressed because his term of enlistment was up about the time when the war started. So he was hoping to get out, and now he's got to get in, and he's got to get in at wartime. Before I get into a broader discussion of the book, I want to go back and remind you of some of the things we were discussing when we talked about Asneth Nicholson's book. The question, of course, is how accurate is these accounts? And remember, I gave you a pitch in various ways you can tell. Remember, what do I know? In other words, what did I see versus what I heard? Am I grandiose? Am I building myself up? Do I ever make mistakes? You see, all these kind of things can help us understand authenticity. I think that he's very good in this respect. He doesn't tell us much of anything except for what he saw. This is what I saw. Remember, I can't remember the name of the bullets, the number of bullets that one of these men had. One of the men had bullets, and these were rounds. These are meant for officers. And later on, the man, I believe he started out with 5 and ended up with 3. And the German deserter said he didn't know what had happened, but this is exactly what he observed. So he's trying to be very good in that respect. There's a couple of times where I go a little bit with him. You see, men do get involved in hand-to-hand combat during the wars, but it's really quite rare. One study I read said less than 1% of all casualties were inflicted in hand-to-hand combat. I mean, when you got high-powered rifles, when you got machine guns, when you have artillery, actually coming to grips hand-to-hand with one man would be rare. Now, of course, it did happen. Remember, one time in the book, the German deserter said, "Here to scream." And he found out in hand-to-hand combat, a German soldier had bitten the face of a Frenchman. And I go, well, I'm sure that's possible. But then I got thinking later on, okay, all right. When it happened twice in the book, I'm going, well, I guess it could have happened twice, but sometimes, perhaps on the fringe, I can say maybe he's overstating this a little bit. But on the other hand, he has a tendency to praise his fellow men, and sometimes he's critical of them as well. One of the more interesting aspects of the book is actually fairly early. Remember, the German soldiers were marching through Belgium. I didn't go into much detail on the German occupation of Belgium, but I did state that Belgium was a neutral country and the Germans invaded. And remember, I said that was inexcusable, though we find this happening by other nations at that time and other times. He talks about the men trying to help the local people, the women, and trying to give them some food. But then the officers intervene. And they say, no, you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to treat these Belgian civilians, shall we say, in a very negative manner. A question I would ask this class if I was standing in front of you right now, unfortunately I cannot do that. I would say, are these bad men? These are Germans, they're bad men. Sometimes people say that, well, if they're the enemy of the United States, later on, 1917, the United States do start fighting the Germans, that anybody who is technically an enemy of the United States, therefore is a bad guy. If you want to look at it a little bit more broadly, we can say that it's not just a bad guy. You're not just a bad guy because you happen to be in uniform of a nation, another nation. But I do ask this question to students: are these bad men? Most students, I think, would agree they're not really bad men, but they do bad things. See, that becomes a big problem for me. They do bad things. They want to do good things. They want to help the Belgian civilians, but they can't. Their officers intervene. Can we say these people aren't bad, but the system is bad? Can we say these men aren't bad, but they're forced to do things they would not normally do or wouldn't do under any other circumstances? The question of evil is something that has been bandied about since the First World War, and of course bandied about in the Second World War and the Holocaust as well. And how do you get good people or normal people like you and me to do things they don't want to do? My perspective is limited, but I do have something. As I might have mentioned a couple of times in class, I'm technically a veteran. I was in the Navy Reserves. Far be it from me to say that, to give you an idea of what it's like to be in combat. On the other hand, I do have a few insights. And my insight is this. In a military situation, they can force you to do almost anything. There's always somebody who just simply cannot be forced. And they are very rare. The military will set you up in a situation. Those challenges you might be in the mud, you might be tired, you might be hungry. But it is far better to go along with them than it is to buck the system. That's one of the means by which they can get you to do almost anything. His accounts of fighting the French, not trying to do the right thing, and gunning people down. These are things that really do bother me, because I think he's quite honest in what he's doing, and his stories are terrible. The fatigue, the fear, the deaths, doing these things that they don't want to do. And I just lost my screen because I got to play around with it a little bit more. Well, I hope you enjoyed the book, and I hope that you might have broader interests. In my World War I class, I get questions all the time. Oh, professor, have you seen this movie? I go, well, yeah, I think I have. I did. It took a while. I did run out a list of all the motion pictures which I have seen that have a World War I theme. And it's about 70. I did rate them on how you can use these to understand the war, such as 1 star doesn't help very much. 4 asterisks, it does help us understand the war quite a bit. Just a few weeks ago, I saw the movie 1917. It's on my list as a motion picture that you should see sometime in your life. A couple of others which I would mention: It's All Quiet on the Western Front, 1930 version. Lawrence of Arabia. Oh, What a Lovely War. Paths of Glory is a stunning piece of work. In any event, let's go on. When the screen went blank, it looks like I lost my page number up here. So let's get back down and show you where we're discussing again. Colonial Africa, World War I. Okay, Battles of Verdun and the Somme. Well, how far of an experience does this go? Depending on which book you want to read. Some books say there were 60 million men involved in the war. Some say 65 million men. I've read other books that said 70 million men. I'm not sure which is completely accurate, but can we argue very strongly that there's a very large percentage of manpower in virtually every European country and many other countries as well that have this experience of going to war. But there's an issue which we call, excuse me, there's an issue which we call the teeth to tail ratio. Let me drink and I'll go back. Teeth to tail. The tail is your support groups. These are the men that are behind the fronts. These are company clerks. These are guys who drive trucks. These are people that work in hospitals. They're technically in the military, but they're not in the front lines. The men who are on the front lines, they're the teeth. They're the people actually doing the fighting. During the American involvement in Vietnam, the teeth to tail ratio was quite dramatic, because for every man you had in combat in Vietnam, you had support groups of 9 or 10. So the teeth to tail ratio was like 9 or 10 to 1. In the First World War, it is quite a bit different. I haven't seen a good study on this, but one study I did read stated that in France, the teeth to tail ratio was like 1 to 1. For every man you had in the trenches, you had one man supporting him. So if that being the case, and let's use this just as a point of argument, that 60 to 70 million men, of those, half would be in combat. Okay, this is 30 million men, roughly, right? However, as we look at the casualty rates, we find that about 30 million men were actually casualties. This is killed, wounded, gassed, insane. Of this 30 million, which book do you want to read? If you believe, and I don't think we should always do this, if you believe the casualty reports we get from various countries, between 8.5 million and 9 million men were actually killed. A lot of times casualty figures are politically motivated, and a lot of nations in reality don't want to admit they lost the number of men that they lost. Can we say sometimes, therefore, the official numbers can be questioned? I'm old school. Way back when they were saying that about 11 million men actually were killed, but some studies say, okay, even that is a low estimate, and it could have been much higher. Of these 30 million casualties, virtually every man who went in, on the average, ended up being killed or wounded. Some of these men had been wounded twice. Some of these men had been wounded 3 times. Many years ago, back in the 70s, I met a gentleman who was an Englishman, and he was born in 1900. I go, whoa, you would have been 18 in 1918. So I asked him about his military service. Well, his birthday was late in 1918, so he was not drafted. However, he volunteered some information to me. He said that his brother had been in the British Army, and he'd been wounded, was it 3 times and gassed twice. So sometimes these casualty figures clearly represent not just a person being wounded once. Sometimes these men were wounded a number of times. Now, he said his brother had survived, and of course I realize now that one of your best ways to survive is actually not to stick it out in the trenches, but if you happen to be wounded for the time of your convalescence, that does give you a chance to be a few weeks, at least very likely a few months, when you're not in the trenches. So that increases your chance of survival. So being wounded isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it's a good thing. How many people actually died? Let's look at civilians as well. This is not often examined. In smaller countries like Serbia, the casualty rates and loss of civilian lives very high. In the nation did not exist at the time, but we would call it Poland. Many hundreds of thousands of Poles died. There's a lot of combat took place in Poland. In Russia, including the revolution and starvation, people died there as well. There were actually pogroms. This is when we persecute Jews in 1918, and tens of thousands of people died there. And that's probably a relation or some similarities, or relation to what was going on in the war. We throw all that in, and what do you end up with? Including civilians, maybe, this is probably a high figure, I hope it is, maybe 24 million dead. It's a huge, huge number. Sometimes people call the World War I generation the lost generation. Yeah, it's used, that term, however, is used not just in that context. It's also used in other contexts. But we can say that a very large percentage of manpower in numerous countries, France, Britain, Italy, Germany, Russia. A very large percentage of these men died, or had the psychological experience of going through the war. Let's take a look at that. The psychological impact of the war goes way beyond the actual combat itself, because so many of the men have psychological problems for the remainder of their lives. I firmly believe that one of the worst of all possible human experiences is to be deployed in a rifle company in wartime. It is literally a horrific experience. World War I is not a war of movement. We see this more often in World War II, when the U.S. forces are sweeping across France starting in August 1944. They're not involved heavily in combat. They're movement. Of course, later on, when they face the Siegfried Line and facing Germany, of course, the Battle of the Bulge becomes involved in December 1944. Then you have more intense combat. Battles in the First World War we often call as when these enormous attacks are taking place. And I gave you an example of a couple of those, which are the Verdun and the Somme, which we discussed last time. Well, in the trenches, you're in the trenches constantly. These aren't often considered battles, but men die every day. Shelling isn't often intense, but a shell is sent over virtually every day. Mortars are sent over every day. Snipers are involved. And some of the more horrific examples of the war, men were often sent out in patrols in no man's land. That's the space between the enemy lines. These didn't really accomplish an awful lot. You can get a little bit closer. Maybe you can grab a prisoner. If you get close enough for a trench raid, in other words, you get close enough to throw in some grenades, you can inflict some casualties on other people. But one of the reasons why the officers, the high command, ordered these kinds of things to be done was to make sure the men don't have the hunker down mentality. We are up, we are moving around. So in times of combat, when you're ordering large numbers of men forward, you will find them less reluctant to go. At least that was the theory. These are horrific experiences. I remember reading an autobiography of a man who was in the Korean War, and he was deployed in these kinds of things, these raids. The Chinese are on hills over here, and the Americans are on hills over here. You go down between the hills, and you do some pretty awful things, and you try to fire back and forth and throw a few grenades, those kind of things to keep pressure up on your adversaries. I remember reading that when he said he went out on one of these patrols, that he gave the most fervent and heartfelt prayer of his life. Not that he would live, but he would die quickly. Quite frankly, that was the only escape. Fortunately, he did survive. But you see, you have the experience of millions, if not tens of millions of men that are placed in these incredibly challenging situations. You're up in the trenches. The trenches stink. They stink because of rotten bodies. Many bodies, hundreds of thousands of bodies are never buried. They're just simply left to rot. Or you throw them in a shell hole and throw a little dirt over them. Rats come and they eat the bodies. The rats get very fat. And the rats will come and bite your toes. And sometimes more ferocious rats will even come and grab your food. Men spend a lot of time trying to kill rats, but they never are able to actually destroy the problem. You're covered in body lice. The British call these cooties. The body lice, and I've already mentioned this when we're talking about the Irish potato famine, but body lice suck your blood, and they're pretty nasty little guys. Why you have body lice? Well, because you're in the filth all the time. You can, when you're taken out of the front for a rest area, one of the first things you do is delouse yourself. You go and you get in a shower and get some Lysol and kills the bugs. Well, but you're in the trenches and you've got to deal with them there, and the cleanliness is really not an option, and not a strong option. So what you do is you actually have to take your shirt off, your trousers off, and you can take the little suckers, you can smash them. More often you have a candle, and you either pull them off and drop them in a candle, or course, they lay their eggs in the seam and got to kill the eggs. So you take the seam of your trousers, the seam of your shirt, and have it ever so gently near this small flame. It could be a candle to kill them. But even that doesn't get rid of the problem. Quite frankly, you have this problem. And they're not going to let you sleep because they're going to eat you up. And let's look at a trench. One of my favorite photographs, if I can find it right here. These are Canadians in a trench up here. Now, I don't know how well you can see that, but one of the things it shows me here is, of course, this is not the best trench you've ever seen, but there's a duckboard down here, so you don't have to stand in the mud all the time. There's a man watching. If he sticks his head too far, a sniper will kill him, blow his head off. There's a man sleeping right here. His head's crooked over to one side. A man's laying down here. There's a couple of guys who are under this wood protection. So if a errant shell comes over, they won't necessarily be killed. You're going to have to be awfully tired to be able to do these kind of things. Quite frankly, many men, when went up the trenches, would rotate up, and sometimes they were several days up in the trenches before they rotated back. And sometimes they got no sleep at all. It can be psychologically disturbing to go without sleep. It's very bad for your health, as you well know. Going one day without sleep is not terribly pleasant. 2 or 3 in a row, which I've never had that experience, I'm very glad to say, can be devastating. And actually, this is hard on your mentality. Sometimes men who've been deprived of sleep never really get their mental equilibrium back. And many men are going to have to go through periods, days, without sleep on a periodic basis every time they're actually in the trenches. I had a fascinating experience a number of years ago. I was walking between buildings on campus. And you know how it is, you get around friendly people. Some people really like to strike up conversations. I'm walking between buildings. There's this guy, he's walking next to me. And we start with a little conversation. And in the course of the conversation, he mentions he's a Vietnam War veteran. And I said, well, I teach military history courses, World War I, World War II. And I've even taught the Vietnam course, by the way. Nonetheless, taught a bunch of these. And I said, it's too bad there's no way I can actually relate the human experience of how awful this was to my students. And he says, oh, it's not as different as you might think. I go, really? He says, well, we'll bring it down to their level, the kinds of things they've experienced. And these are the kinds of things he mentioned. He said, well, have you ever ask your students if they've ever broken a finger? And I've never broken a finger. I've broken an arm. I've broken ankles. So yeah, I know what that's like a little bit. He says, okay, ask them to remember the broken finger. Sleep deprived, well, I've gone one night without sleep, but I haven't gone many nights. But he asked the students, have you ever had that experience? Well, have you been sick? I mean, you know, sick, sore throat. Not so sick you can't move your eyeballs, but you know, you really feel lousy. And then you have to go out and do something. That can be very strenuous. Have you ever been in a car accident? Have you ever been battered around? Have you ever seen that kind of thing? Yeah, car accidents are very unpleasant. People get hurt. Have you ever been afraid? No, really afraid. Not that, well, I didn't study for this test, or I'm on the football pitch, might get ran over. No, have you really been afraid? I don't think I've been that afraid in my life. But then he did a fascinating thing. He said, put all that together. You're sick, you're abused. The sergeants aren't going to be very nice to you, neither are the lieutenants. You're sick, you're abused, you're hurt, you're tired, you're hungry, you're afraid. It's like taking every worst day of your life and put them in one day, and then do that day after day. Let's throw in the nights as well, day after day, night after night, and see what that does to you mentally. After having this brief conversation with this Vietnam War veteran, I had another good friend who's also a Vietnam War veteran. Fascinating man. He's the kind of guy you could talk to. I'll ask him almost anything. He didn't know. He wouldn't tell you. If he did know, he would be very explicit in some cases. And I asked him, is that accurate? Is that one way you can relate to the military experience? He looked at me and says, yes, that's a very good way of looking at it. So I'm talking about the psychological damage here. It was so awful in the trenches that very often men would do anything to get out of it. Yes, we read about suicides. Men will kill themselves. You can kill yourself or you can have the enemy do it. Many years ago, I had a conversation with a World War II veteran. Actually, he had an interesting experience in both World War II and Korean War. And I don't know why. I wish I had handled the conversation a bit better, but I talked about courage. And he kind of brushed me off. He said, a lot of times people with medallions are just lucky, or the press got a hold of them. And he said, a lot of times brave men are suicides. Men who do stupid things. They run against machine guns. They run against positions. And very likely they might be killed. But if they're not killed and get close enough to do damage to the enemy, then they get decorated. So he was a little bit disparaged on exactly what courage is. But in World War I, all you have to do to be killed, stick your head up. Bam. Sniper will take you out and you're dead. You can call that suicide. Yes, you can. But at least the family doesn't have the stigma of thinking that you shot yourself. Let me give you an example of how awful this could have been. These are some of these first-person accounts which I mentioned earlier, which really stick with me. I'm reading that these are British accounts. There was a man who was shot. He said he was shot. He got hit in the chest, and I can't imagine how much pain that would have been. He collapses to the bottom of the trench, and before he passes out from the pain and loss of blood, he's sitting there saying to himself, "Thank God, thank God, thank God, I get out of it." Another British account. Men have this man has a bayonet on his rifle up here. So the bayonets were long and they were meant to do damage. Anyway, this other man was in a trench, and an officer was being quite stupid apparently with his bayonet and actually stabbed this guy in the leg with the bayonet. Of course, the officer apologized, which is rare for an officer. He apologized and said, "Oh, I'm sorry I did this." And the guy says, "Oh, no, sir, thank you very much, because now I get to get out of it." Just yesterday, I was reading another book on World War I. And I've read these kind of things, which is very hard for me to get to wrap around. The men were actually going to prostitutes, having unprotected relations, in hopes they would get venereal disease, in hopes that they would use venereal disease to get out of the trenches. My goodness, there's no cure for venereal disease. Certainly not syphilis this time frame. I mean, this is a malady that people know that can drive you insane. It's a problem you're going to have for the rest of your life. Well, see, I become skeptical about these kind of accounts. I want to see an account by somebody who actually had that done, who actually admitted that he did that on purpose. However, just reading yesterday, the author was saying that there were men who were buying pus from people who had gonorrhea and scraping that onto their private parts in hopes that they would get gonorrhea. I'm going, well, I've still got to read the man's footnotes, but I'm finding this in too many places to simply dismiss it. Hopefully that's an exaggeration, but I think within context, how awful of a situation this was. A lot of guys pick up bad habits. They pick up smoking because smoking will take the edge off of your pain. Nicotine apparently is somewhat of an antidepressant. Alcohol. Some of the armies were literally drunk. Every day the British got a ration of rum. They got it in the evening usually. Saying that the French fought on wine. Every day the French got a liter of wine. And I forget, it was about 14% of wine is actually alcohol. So you got a liter of wine, which is probably a jug about that big, that much alcohol. That's enough to give you a buzz. I was reading an Italian account, an Italian front. They're down fighting the Austrians in the snow, and the Austrians were so drunk that you could smell the brandy literally from the trenches 100, 200 yards away at least, coming over. And of course, he's talking about all the Frenchmen getting, all the Italians getting looped too. The only way you could stand it is if you had something to take the edge off. Okay, psychological damage. In First World War, they call it shell shock, the idea that the concussion of a shell can influence your brain. Recently, there was an attack on U.S. forces by missiles from, I believe it was Iran sent them over. And no Americans were killed, but was it 50? Stated that they'd had some problems with their headaches, maybe the concussion. So that's a problem that could exist even today. One author I read, a psychologist, was writing about the First World War, about warfare in general, said, including the First World War, said that some of the psychological damage actually comes from killing a human being. My friend, whom I could ask questions about Vietnam, said the first time he ever killed somebody, actually it was two somebodies, he killed two men at the same time. He said he went into a complete funk. He almost couldn't function. He put it this way, Dr. Jack Daniels whiskey got him through. After 2 weeks, he was okay. He said after a while, kill anybody, anytime, and not feel it, not feel a thing. We went to lunch after this conversation, and as I'm sitting across from him, I did remove his knife and his fork, just in case. I didn't do that. I told him I was going to. But just in case you decided you wanted to use something. Well, I think I'm making a good picture. Let me say one other thing. During the wars, we almost had to take a look at how people were acting to see what was going on. And it's true in the First World War, and men, they hear a noise, they go underneath tables, even though they're back in hospitals. They show a man in an officer's hat, and they scream and run away. And they are people that go, there's things wrong with them physically. There's nothing, I said that wrong. There's things that they're not wrong with them physically, but they're blind and they can't move an arm. And of course, psychiatry is not advanced enough to deal with this properly. Let's go to Vietnam, however. In the 1990s, I was reading the New York Times, ran across an article. And what they could do in the 1990s, which they could not do in the 60s and 70s during Vietnam, is use scans. I think they're CAT scans. You actually look at your brain. You can see where the blood flow is. And I'm afraid to have that done because I'm afraid maybe there'll be gaps in there. Hey, buddy, you don't have any brains. They took Vietnam veterans and scanned their brains. Remember, only about 10% of the men in Vietnam are actually in combat. But it was psychologically damaged on the people who were not in combat. Of these men, 17% of them had a shrunken hippocampus. I don't know that much about your brain. It's in your brain. I think it deals with emotions. I think it deals somewhat with memory. One of the reasons why these men have flashbacks. 17% of these men had shrunken hippocampuses. And yes, they are the men with psychological problems. So there is actually physical damage done to the brain. Sometimes people used to say when I was younger that your heart can malfunction, your liver can malfunction. You can have a kidney disease, but your brain cannot malfunction. Now, your brain can malfunction, and this does happen because of war. Well, these men come home and very pleased to survive in many cases. Sometimes they come home and they can't live with their memories, they can't live with the flashbacks, and sometimes they become alcoholics. After Vietnam, a lot of these people are drug addicts. And I remember reading an autobiography. This is not an autobiography. There's a book called Flags of Our Fathers. It was written by one of the sons of the men who raised the flag on Mount Suribachi, Iwo Jima. Remember, there's a famous picture raising the flag on Iwo Jima. This might be the most famous photograph of the Second World War. There were 6 men involved. It's hard to see. All 6 of them are right there. In fact, one man, you can only see his hand. There were 6 men involved. 3 of those men were killed. 3 of them survived. A book, Flags of Our Fathers, was written by one of the sons of one of the men who survived. And he said this about his father, among other things. Every night before he went to bed, he had to have a double martini, because the only way he could sleep was to be blitzed out. These men come home, and sometimes it takes their entire lifetime to regain their humanity, and sometimes they never do it. I remember reading a Vietnam War veteran's experience, and he said, I went to Vietnam to prove that I was a man. When I came home, ever since I've been trying to get my manhood or my humanity back. These men come home, and sometimes they don't make the best husbands. They have anger issues. They're violent. They're mean. They have kids. Kids make noise and irritate them, and the way they strike out is they hit them and they're mean to them. Now, I'm technically a baby boomer kid. I was born just a few years after the Second World War, and so that my generation were the generation of the people that were in the service. Now, it does depend on what you did. I mean, if you're just down fixing aircraft in San Diego, that's probably not a terrible problem. The closer you get to combat, the more likely you are to have psychological problems. Let me just tell you a few stories. There was a woman I dated at Utah State, went out with her a few times. I don't know why she went out with me. She didn't like me. But in any event, she went out with me a few times. I got to know her well enough for her to tell her story. And she was 13 years old, and she's reading a book. And she's in the living room reading a book. Her father couldn't take it. But she's reading a book, right? So he came, slapped the book out of her hand, and slapped her. She's crying. She's trying to get away from him. She runs away. She goes in the bedroom. He comes after her. He pushes her down in the bed and starts wailing on her. And then he collapsed on the floor crying. She asked her mother about this later on. He said, your father was the kindest man I ever knew. And then he went to war. I believe he was in the Navy. And this is essentially what's left over. Had a roommate. His dad was on Iwo Jima. I remember asking him a question. Your dad went into Iwo Jima? Yes. When did he go in? First day. Wow. When was he wounded? He says he wasn't wounded. About 80% of those men were wounded. So he beat the odds. I knew my roommate and I met his sister. His sister said that when his dad came back from the service, that first thing he did was throw her, whack her around and throw her out of the room. My friend, my roommate, told me that his brother talked him into shooting me in the head. In other words, he had simply had a pistol. And my friend was, he says, about 5 years of age. And his brother showed him, you see, this is what you do. You see, I'm going to point this right here, and you just take this little lever right here and you pull it. And so he pulled it. He shot his brother in the brain. Now, if you're committing suicide, that's a bad way to do it. You might survive, unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to look at it. But you also might go blind. It was one of those areas where the bullet actually said went in. It did not destroy the entirety of the brain. It kind of went between the lobes or something, so the brother almost had a full recovery. But this is quite remarkable. Why would you do that? Well, the father, the veteran of Iwo Jima, was so incredibly abusive to the children that it messed all them up. And quite frankly, my roommate was very messed up, as were his siblings and the other members of his family. Look at my generation. Long-haired hippie freaks. Yeah, in the 60s, growing your hair long, don't have a job, smoking dope, getting on drugs, all these kind of things. What's different about us? I'm not prepared I have to say an answer, but I want to say this much, that in reality, the kinds of things that happen to us is probably because our parents, our father, was actually so messed up. I'm telling you too many stories, but let me throw this one out as well. During the Second World War, Dad was in the Army. Dad got drafted. Didn't go to combat, but he had to go through basic training. Any event, Mom was hanging around in hometown. My two older brothers were small children at that time frame. Of course, she's got friends, girls, women she knew in high school. And when the war was over, I got this in one of her letters. She didn't tell me this, but it's one of her letters which I read after she died. That her friend, one of her friends, had been waiting for a man to come back from the service for 4 years to marry him. And as soon as he came back, she was afraid. She was afraid of him. She was afraid to marry him. He had a drinking problem and he was violent. I found in her obituary that she did not marry him. She married somebody else. So the impact of men having psychological problems is not just on them. It can last next generation, even generations after that. There was a woman a long time ago, little old lady, cute little old lady, took one of my history classes. In fact, she took this history class. That's very flattering because she wasn't taking it for credit. It was even more flattering that she took it twice. And maybe not nearly as forcefully as I'm doing for you today, I also told her about these kinds of things. And like I say, this is true of many other wars, but I'm introducing it in the First World War. It is also true of Korea, Vietnam, and the Second World War. She stopped me after class one time, said, you know, my husband was a World War II veteran. By that time, during the conversation, he had passed. But she called him a rascal. She says, he was a rascal. She said, I never realized that he might be putting up with psychological problems. This should not be a secret, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm not a pacifist, but before you send men into war, you really have to realize the kinds of things that are going to happen because of that. And it's not just combat injuries, there's psychological problems as well. You're probably aware that there is major problems with Iraqi vets, that their suicide rate is almost twice the national average. And that doesn't mean they're not suffering psychologically. So, any event, let's go on. The war ends in a German defeat. Let me make that completely clear. The war ends in a German defeat. Germany was defeated. Sometimes people believe in the stab in the back legend that somehow the Germans were still fighting on and they could have continued to go on, but there was people back behind the lines who was at fault. When I was taking a 19th century class at Utah State, this is the 1970s, the professor says, well, World War I turned out pretty good for the Germans. I'm going, what? He says, well, look at the economy of Germany today. What? I'm sure that many years after the war, what the economy is like really has no reflection on the war. The Germans lost. The armistice ended the war between Britain, Germany, America, Germany. And it ends the fighting. This is on November 11th, 1918. The Germans simply had to throw in the towel. They had to give up. There's rebellions at home. They can't supply the men. The men are actually in the front, are becoming unreliable. Some of these men aren't responding to what the officers are doing, and sometimes they're falling back without orders. And the army has been slowly falling back because they can't stand up against the British pressure and the French and American pressure as well. So it's virtually capitulation. The terms of the armistice, they have to withdraw several miles. They have to leave France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. They have to give actually all their machine guns, their artillery to the Allies. They have to give their trains and their carrying stock over to the Allies, and they have to allow for Allies to come in and occupy some German territory. This is a capitulation. Now, one of the reasons why Germany collapsed was a lack of resources, a lack of fertilizers, which meant that food crops would be less, and lack of food. There's not enough food in Germany to support their people. That's largely because of the blockade, because the British were very successful in keeping foodstuffs from going into Germany. Well, the British decided not to lift the blockade. See, the war ends in November, but the British keep up the blockade December, January, February, March, April, May, June, July. It's not until July that they actually allowed foodstuffs now to be brought in. See, why would they do that? Well, they want to teach Germany a lesson. I find this a little bit remarkable. The German people didn't make the decisions to go to war. There were some other people. The German people aren't responsible for what the generals did. But they're part of the German nation. They should have done something, nobody knows what. But they had to be punished. Part of that was this. And the other issue was that you're going to have a peace settlement called the Peace of Paris. And they wanted to make sure that Germany will sign anything, no matter how humiliating, no matter how much it hurts them. In March 1919, the Germans said, look, our people are starving. We've got to have food. We'll do anything. The Germans had already offered them gold. I go, gold? I need to do more research on this. Did Germany have gold at the end of the First World War? Maybe they did. One of the reasons why the British wouldn't take gold for food is that, well, during a peace settlement, they're going to make the Germans give them all their resources anyway. So why sell them food, why give them food for gold when they just take the gold anyway? In March 1918, the Germans were able to negotiate this with the British. If they handed over the entire merchant marine, the German merchant marine, including luxury liners, to the British, they would allow some food. They don't lift the blockade, some more food to come in. So a lot of the more impressive German, I should say British, luxury liners at the end of the First World War were in fact German in origin. One of the reasons I'm making a deal over this is that it does give you a pretty good idea that a few years later, when Hitler started to preach hatred against the Allies, particularly Britain in this case, they're going to find a listening ear. We believe because the death rates go up because of the blockade during the First World War, that over 700,000, 750,000, something like that, Germans actually died because of the effects of the blockade, largely because of lack of nutrition. German children are starving. Herbert Hoover, later an American president, who's over trying to get relief to occupied Belgium during the war and later to Germany at the end of the war, made a very interesting observation at the end of the Second World War. And he speculated that a lot of these children who didn't get proper food when they were developing, this is actually during the First World War, children, teenagers, who needed fats, who needed more nutrition, did not get it. And because they didn't get it, that causes psychological problems, including violence. And he speculated maybe some of the brutal actions we hear about coming from the Germans during the Second World War was because these men did not get enough nutrition during the First World War. Interesting thesis, virtually hard to prove. Shall we say, impossible to prove. Is there an insight here? Perhaps. But we do know that thousands of children died of rickets and vitamin deficiencies. And of course, a lot of them had their growth stunted because of this. So Germany will sign anything. Peace of Paris. Peace of Paris is a number of treaties. You've heard of the Treaty of Versailles. That's the most famous one. In fact, the Treaty of Versailles is the one between the Allies and Germany. And because of this being perhaps the more impressive of all of them, that it is the one we hear the most about. But there were a number of treaties, including treaties with Austria, treaties with Hungary, and they took place in and around the various suburbs of Paris. So taking all that as a body, we tend to call this the Peace of Paris. The Treaty of Versailles, okay. We say it's a bad peace. It's not terribly surprising to be a bad peace if you say a bad peace is punishing your enemy. Some people would argue very strongly, look, these people did bad things, they needed to be punished. Once again, was it the German people who did those bad things, or was it the Kaiser, the political military leaders? Nonetheless, people want to punish the entirety of a nation. A good peace would be a peace that everybody involved want to keep. An example is the Peace of Vienna in 1814 and 1815. When the heads of Europe went to Vienna, and between visiting your mistresses and going to balls, they did negotiate what we shall do with France. France was not severely punished at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Everybody says French are bad people. Look what they've done now for 22 years. Holy mackerel. Shouldn't they be punished? People say, no, let's not punish them. In fact, they invited the French to come over and say, look, these are not Napoleonic French. These are people there afterwards. How can we set up a situation in which France will not be vengeful? They don't take territory from France. France doesn't lose territory. France is later on forced to pay a small reparation. But it does not leave France impoverished. It does not leave France with a spirit of revenge. Second World War, First World War, I should say. Bad peace. Why is the bad peace? The governments, can we say the government of Italy, the government of France, the government of Britain, have spent the entire war saying it is the Germans' fault, it's the Austrians' fault. By darn, and these people are going to pay. And remember, in 1814, 1815, the nations don't have to work with democracies so much. Quite frankly, it's the royal heads of Europe. If you're dealing with democracies and you renege on your promises, we are going to punish these people. And you don't do that, well, that can hurt you in the next round of elections. These parliamentary democracies. So they're going to follow through on that. Treaty of Versailles. This is the most famous of them all. This is the one that was signed in June 1918. Germany loses territory, okay. The French thought the war was literally fought over the security of France. Not everybody agrees with that. And for example, the British want to get rid of the German Navy. They also want to, does that work? Yeah. They also want to expand the British Empire. Of course, the French want security. They're going to expand the empire as well. The way Britain expands and France expands their empires is they simply go and divide the Middle East between them. They kick out Turkey and they take these areas. Well, Germany before the war looked something like this. So you take away the territories. Poland was created at the end of the First World War. They don't want to be a landlocked country. They want a port. So there's a port up here called Danzig. And even though over 90% of the people in some of these areas are Germans and 10% are Poles, they give this to Poland. This is the Polish corridor. They didn't give Danzig to Poland, but it became an international city. In other words, it would be jointly administered by the Germans and the Poles, which of course is somewhat challenging. The Poles want an area of more coal, so they take this area of Silesia down here. Belgium had fought in the war. It's hard to see on this map. Let's reward Belgians, give them a few miles of Germans. These aren't Belgians, they're Germans. And they're still part of Belgium, they still speak German. Alsace-Lorraine had been taken by the Germans from the French in the Franco-Prussian War, so Alsace-Lorraine is given back. Now notice this line going up here. This is the Rhineland where Germany will never, ever, ever, ever be able to put troops again. In other words, they can never threaten France. The French initially wanted to break Germany up into little bitty pieces and make it separate countries. Well, then they decided, well, that might be too challenging because the Germans will try to reunite. But, well, maybe Germany will want to get this area back later on. Oh, by the way, let's look what happened up here. A chunk of Germany goes to Denmark. And Denmark was not even involved in the war at all. So let's give them peace. But Germany is resentful for all of this, no doubt at all. Loses territory weak. It cannot have an army more than 100,000 men, which means that you got a big problem on your hands. Anybody, I mean, Belgium has a much bigger army than that. Even small countries, Switzerland, if they wanted to invade Germany, Germany would have virtually very, very small mechanism by which they can possibly defend their country. Can we say a lot of the reasons why they allowed them to have a German army at all was for internal security? Maybe you need somebody to put down riots if the police can't handle it. Germany is going to be occupied till 1934 in some of these areas. Military occupation. The French want German coal to rebuild their nation. There's a famous guilt clause in the Treaty of Versailles in which it states the German nation, the German people, are all responsible for the war. Once again, I think that's a very broad statement, and it goes farther than anything I'm stating, because if they say that the German people are responsible, then they can punish the German people, including the payment of reparations, so I'll get to in 1 minute. However, this goes farther than this, because the payments are going to take place for many, many decades, for generations, literally after the war is over. So you're actually punishing Germans unborn for something that happened many years before they were even around. Guilt clause is awfully, awfully hard for many Germans to swallow. If Germany, therefore, is responsible, German people, as well as the nation, responsible for the war and all the loss and damage, for everything that happened. You see, if you're fighting in France and the Germans shoot their shells over and it damaged French soil, and the French are firing back at the Germans on French soil, the French rounds land on French soil, it is the Germans' responsibility for having forced them to defend their country. Germany's going to have to pay for all the physical damage in France. They're going to have to pay for the wounded veterans. And whoa, these are what we call reparations. Of all the things that are involved in the Peace of Paris, reparations is the one that becomes the most controversial and the one that sticks in more people's craw than anything else. Germany is going to be forced to pay the total cost of the war. It's $33 billion. I mean, as you look at the federal budgets we have in the world today, that doesn't seem like much money at all. I mean, they're talking about a bailout package, which I think is going to pass Congress today, that of giving the American people something like $2 trillion to deal with the problems of the coronavirus and the shutdown of the U.S. economy. And $33 billion back at this time frame was an enormous sum, much more than the entire GNP of many nations. I don't hear much about this, particularly later on in the Second World War, but I did run across a newspaper article, and I was literally shocked. I thought that these debts had been forgotten or dismissed. No. The last payment was actually made in 2010. In other words, 91 years, or shall I say 92 years after the war was over. Austria-Hungary's broken up. Let's put 1919 on that, how it's broken up. This is what it looked like, and it's broken up into these are nationalities. You can see how challenging it would be to create various nations on the basis of nationality. Austria speaks German, and these areas of which we now call the Czech Republic speaks German, spoke German. These people were thrown out at the end of the Second World War. But these people were not allowed to be part of Austria. Somebody else wanted them. Austria did not want to be a country. They voted, actually over 99% of the people in the important vote, the plebiscite, wanted to be part of Germany. Of course, France would not allow this. There's no way that we're having more German-speaking people in Germany. The Magyars over here in Hungary, anybody wanted a piece of them, took it as well. So let's have a look at the countries that were created, if I can find a map of that. Yeah, this was the old Austrian Empire, chunk given to Italy. So this area, the Croatians, go down to Serbia. The Romanians get Transylvania. Even though there's a lot of Hungarian-speaking peoples up in here, Czechoslovakia takes that. So Austria-Hungary is broken up. One of the reasons why this is a tragedy is we have a major artery of trade. And this is the Danube River. It starts in southern Germany, runs through Vienna, Austria, and it eventually goes down into the Black Sea. It's a major, major area of transportation. Well, now we have all these new countries that didn't exist before. Yugoslavia, Austria, Hungary. And they want to protect their economic interests, so they set up trade barriers. And these trade barriers have a tendency to inhibit the economies, not really help them. There is a British economist, can we say maybe the first half of the 20th century? John Maynard Keynes is the most famous of all the economists in the world. And he was with the British delegation that went to Paris in 1919. And very shortly after the end of the armistice, he wrote a book called The Economic Consequence of the Peace. And he wrote it very rapidly. It's a very easy read. He criticizes what's happening in breaking up all these people because the trade barriers are going to hurt the economy. And he said, however, his biggest single criticism is actually the payment of reparations. You see, France says, well, get Germany to pay for all of our problems. Get Germany to pay for all of our physical damage. And Keynes says, actually, that's a bad idea. Why is it bad to have everybody pay for your problems? Because everything that you produce in Germany and you transport to France for free hurts that sector of the French economy. The bridge, if you're having the Germans rebuild all the bridges in France, then what does that do to your bridge building economy in France? It kills it. What does that do to your brick masons? What does that do to your carpenters? What does that do to your mechanics? If everything's produced in Germany. Yeah, you're getting things for free, but you're actually damaging your economy. This doesn't do Germany any favors because they're producing to ship it someplace else. I like one thing that he said here. He said it is the best for everybody, socially and politically, to make sure that the economies are strong. Well, I missed it. And the economies are strong because, well, you need a way to jumpstart the economy. You need money. Well, the only nation in the world that has a lot of money left over, a lot of money they can spend, is the United States. And Keynes did indicate that it would be best for all people involved to have the United States pump a lot of money into Europe to keep all these areas economically viable and rather than being economically weak. Probably a good idea. Now, some people say, well, the United States should have done something. Britain, for example, had borrowed much money from the United States. And they said, oh, by the way, we need your, would you forgive the loans? Well, Calvin Coolidge, President of the United States in the 1920s, said, well, you hired the money, didn't you? Maybe it would have been better for Britain had we forgiven that debt. Now, I'm here tonight to say something in the honor of the United States. Maybe we should have done more. Maybe we should be like the Second World War with the Marshall Plan starting in 1948, where we infused huge amounts of money in Europe to build up Europe economically and help them socially and do away with a lot of the problems, which we unfortunately saw at the end of the First World War. But to say the United States did nothing is not quite true. The United States in the 1920s had what we call easy money policy. In other words, you could borrow money from the United States at very low interest rates, and the payment of these amount of money, the payments were over such a lengthy period of time. In fact, the money was practically free. In the 1920s, a lot of the reparation payments that went from Germany actually started in the United States. The United States loans the money to Germany, and Germany gives it to France. Until the stock market collapsed and the economic problems in the United States, starting in 1929. Europe, primarily Germany and France, are actually afloat in US dollars, or buy US dollars. Well, Let's look at these countries again, the new countries: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary. All of these countries are have economic problems. I think economic problems leads to political problems. All of them end up in a dictatorship before the First World War. The only example, the only one that is able to maintain a parliamentary democracy was Czechoslovakia. Can we say the economic consequences of the peace were quite right as Keynes saw them? And there are some real big problems. Well, Germany has lost large amounts of manpower. There's very little physical damage on Germany because the fighting took place elsewhere. But Germany has unrest problems. There's revolts in various places of Germany. And finally, in late 1923, Germany defaulted on a payment. I believe it was telegraph poles. And they were supposed to, the consignment was supposed to be such a number, and in reality, they didn't get them. And because this didn't happen, France takes drastic action. You see, what France decided that, look, they fudged. It wasn't like they didn't give the telegraph poles, but in reality, they didn't give enough. We see, we allow them to start fudging, and they'll fudge more and more, and after a while, you'll get fewer and fewer payments and materials. So let's hop on this right now. 1923, Belgium was involved as well. France and Belgium invade Germany. Now there's no war because the Germans can't fight. They, remember, going back to one of our maps right here, remember they couldn't have a military here. So what do you do? How are you going to fight? And however, the France and Belgium come in and occupy the Ruhr primarily, this industrial section right here. Well, this destroys the German economy. The German economy was actually doing quite poorly even before this had taken place. And as much as I would like to finish with this right now and jump into the Soviet Union next time, as I look at my clock, I'm only got a few minutes left. If I go through this too rapidly, I think I will end up distorting it and it'll be a little bit harder for you to understand. So let me tell you my plan next time. On my next lecture, I do plan to discuss this a little bit more thoroughly to get an idea of what's happening. But the bulk of the lecture next time will be on the Soviet Union. In the meantime, I hope the weather is wonderful. I hope you're having the best time ever. And I hope that when the lockdown ends and you can get out and enjoy life a little bit more, that you will do that. In the meantime, may God bless. Let's see.